Hi, welcome to another episode of Blogging Gingers. I'm Kay Steiger with Talking Points Memo.
And I'm Bryce Covert with ThinkProgress.
Thanks for joining me again, Bryce.
Yeah, thank you. In this terrible weather, we find some time to blog our ginger hair together. We've got all sorts of things to chat about, some news and some less covered news. So I'm excited.
Yeah, me too.
So let's just dive in. We were talking a little bit before we started recording about the Super Bowl and the ads, because everybody watched the game, and the game I didn't think was super exciting. I was also rooting for the Broncos, so it was a little bit depressing.
See, I'm a Minnesota Vikings fan, so the Seahawks have the most ex-Minnesota Vikings players, I think.
Okay, that's fair. I mean, I was a little bit torn at heart because I really love the city of Seattle, and I feel like I could maybe move there someday, but I was born in Colorado, and a bunch of my family is there, and I just kept picturing how sad they were around their gigantic TV watching this terrible game.
Yeah, it was pretty brutal.
Yeah, there were like those pictures of sad children in the audience that just kind of broke my heart. But so the game maybe not so interesting unless you're a diehard Seahawks fan. But the ads I was actually really interested in. I mean, so every year I watch the Super Bowl, and I will admit I'm not a huge football fan. I actually find the rules to be really confusing, and I have to relearn them every year. But I watch for sport and being an American, and also to see the ads, because usually, first of all, companies spend a lot of money on these ads, but they have a reputation for being incredibly sexist, and so there's usually every year this Twitter conversation about these sexist ads, sort of breaking down what's sexist about them and pointing it out. Some people, there's this not buying it hashtag, and people will reply to the brands themselves and try to point out the problems with their ads. And I found myself with sort of nothing to do during the commercials this year. It was really, really low key. I don't know if you had sort of the same reaction.
Yeah, and part of me wonders if there are a couple of things happening. I think one, brands are getting a little bit more sensitive to that online reaction and that ability for folks to sort of respond directly to the companies about what they're seeing on TV. And I think increasingly marketers, aren't necessarily saying like any buzz is good buzz. They're increasingly saying, oh, yeah, we'd rather not have to like apologize and fire somebody for tweeting the wrong thing, or like we'd rather like have an ad that has like cross-level appeal. And I think the other thing that's going on is, the NFL itself has been working on sort of expanding who its base of fans are. And, I'm a football fan. I've been a football fan for a while, but, there are a lot of missteps, but I think for a lot of reasons, the NFL is trying, even though they're not always successful in trying to, have more women be fans, because they recognize that if it's something that the whole family can participate in, it's going to be a more valuable enterprise.
Well, right, and if in theory women aren't watching at the same rate as men, although I think women for a while have been watching pretty in substantial numbers, watching the
Yep.
Super Bowl anyway, then it's a market that you should be tapping, right? I mean, you
Hmm.
should be trying to get more women to watch. And I mean, the point that a lot of the sort of backlash campaigns against the sexist ads always makes is that women can control a huge portion of consumer spending. We're huge consumers, and if you're making ads that are turning us away, you're hurting yourself.
Hmm.
I mean, I would think a brand in general would not want to sort of rule out any group of consumers, because then you're missing a whole market, whether or not, you think that they're the most powerful consumers. I mean, you're just going to be hurting yourself to be pushing people away from your product. I don't know if it's that brands sort of thought maybe if it's during the Super Bowl, it's sort of operating in this closed, manly space where female consumers aren't going to see it, even though that's not true.
Hmm.
Or you just have to go big and go bold for the Super Bowl and get noticed, and it's, there's no such thing as bad press. But I think you're right. I think brands are actually figuring out that there is such a thing as bad press. When people are equating your product with, female objectification, or, last year the Audi ad, I actually was really offended by this very casual sort of glorification of what amounted to a sexual assault. It was the one where the high schooler's dad gives him the car, and he goes and he just forces him a kiss on the prom queen, and then her boyfriend punches him. And then you're having to explain why you associated your brand with sexual assault. I do think that ends up having consequences. And it seemed like this was the year where all of that awareness raising around these consequences paid dividends. I mean, well, first of all, GoDaddy is like, the criminal number one when it comes to this stuff. And it helps, I think, that they just got a new CEO. I mean, the old CEO was a character, I'll say, in a diplomatic way. And they were just clearly, that strategy was, naked women. And
although
this year yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, this year there was, they flipped that even a little bit on its head with the David Beckham ad, the H&M David Beckett ad, where he's, basically portraying his naked body, and, it's sort of cutting the other way, if that makes sense. It's like a little bit of female gaze rather than male gaze this time around.
Yeah, I think someone tweeted something like this was the Super Bowl of the female gaze, of male nudity, and it's true. There was the David Beckham, I think it was an H&M ad, was very blatant. I mean, it was basically doing what GoDaddy has been doing for years, where it's not anything to do with your product. I mean, I guess he's wearing some clothes, so maybe they were from H&M, but he wasn't wearing a whole lot of clothing, and he was just sort of running around being naked, and it was like, our product equals David Beckham's naked body.
Yep.
Which is, it's a man, so that you're flipping the script, but I would argue it's just as sexist to be objectifying a man as it is to be objectifying a woman. And then there was an ad for, I don't remember, I think it was maybe Squarespace or some web company where, there was a bunch of naked men half-naked men running through the streets, and then they sort of slammed themselves into a spray tanning salon.
Yep.
And, again, like using naked male bodies to market your product. It was fascinating to watch, honestly, but I wouldn't really call that a real win, right?
So better than last year, but still not winning.
Yeah.
When it comes to the sexism game.
Right. And there were a couple of ads that still had some of the old school sexism, like that really long, it was like multi-part I think it was Bud Light ad with the guy who didn't know he was in the ad, and there was just a point where they were like, twins! He was like, yeah, twins! And it was just these women who had no lines were twins, and I was like, okay, you think men are really dumb and just will drink your product because you associate it with twins.
Yep.
So there was that.
Yep, that too. But yeah, I mean, I would say it was better, but still not great. So
yeah.
Yep.
Still work to be done.
Indeed. Well, let's shift gears a little and tell me more about some of the work you're doing, reporting on some state level legislation that is hopefully going to make women awesome.
Talking about the opposite of sexism. We talked a little bit about this because one of the really cool legislative packages was just introduced in your home state of Minnesota. Yeah, Minnesota. And it was a really great package. It had paid sick days, a minimum wage raise, an expansion of unpaid family leave, and a couple of other things, and a measure aimed at trying to help reduce the gender wage gap. And it came almost exactly a week after a very similar package was introduced in Nebraska that had paid sick leave, it had paid family leave, a minimum wage hike, and I think it's an expansion of the state's earned income tax credit for low-income families. And I was really, there's a lot of things I find interesting about these packages, but one is just the fact that these are packages and that they're very comprehensive. They're both named something, like Women's Equality Act or Women's Equality Measures. And clearly these lawmakers who put them together are looking to help women in the workforce, but do it in a way that tackles a lot of the different challenges they face, which means that they're recognizing the fact that women don't just face one challenge. I think for a long time it's felt very easy to say, I support women's equality in the workplace, and that's why I support the Lilly Ledbetter Act and closing the gender wage gap. Or, I think women should have paid maternity leave, and just sort of picking off one of the pieces. But putting them all together this way illustrates the fact that, women are 2/3 of minimum wage workers. Women are more likely to have to care for children. So when their kids get sick and they have to choose between losing their job or just losing a day's pay and caring for their child, that's a real dilemma. The gender wage gap obviously is a problem that faces a lot of different women. So I'm really heartened to see this happening at the state level. And we talked in our last one a little bit about some of the stuff that's happened at the federal level with Kirsten Gillibrand and Nancy Pelosi doing similar stuff. So I was really excited about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also worth pointing out that in Minnesota, the Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the governorship. So it has a shot at passing and becoming law. So we'll see. So that's exciting. And I think this is like one of those great things where you can point out how, like states can try things in their own way on a local level. And, it's the old, states are the laboratories of democracy kind of idea. Like with healthcare, the healthcare plan in Massachusetts, they tried it out there first to see how it would go. And, although the rollout was definitely a little rockier on the federal level, it's kind of exciting to see states really committing to trying new ways of sort of social safety net and really trying to help women be better and more productive participants in the economy, because, it's always so shocking to me that we're still having a debate about like whether we should support universal child care or universal paid sick leave and all these things, because, women have been nearly 50% of the workforce for decades now, and it seems like we still have a societal structure that's sort of based on this idea that if you make this amount of money or more, or if you're like if you're a woman of a certain class, you'll stay home, and if you're a working woman, you'll still just have to deal with it because we're not going to help you.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point about states, too. I mean, obviously right now, on a whole range of issues, Congress is not getting a whole lot done. But for people who care about these issues, there's actually a lot of interesting activity happening at the state level. I mean, 3 states have paid family leave now. Rhode Island became the 3rd last year. Nebraska has now put forward this package that includes it, and a couple other states are potentially working towards it. Paid sick days has had last year was huge for paid sick days, and the 8th paid sick days law was just passed in Newark. So that's sort of slowly advancing on the state level. Minimum wage raises are just everywhere. We did a map at ThinkProgress right ahead of the State of the Union that was just looking at all the different states that either have legislation or a ballot measure campaign aimed at raising it. And the map is just full of color. There's just a lot of action going on, which is really cool. But yeah, what's great about the Minnesota one is that it might actually have some chances of passing. But Nebraska was really cool too, because Nebraska is a really red state, and it may not have a chance of passing there, but it's interesting to see this idea crop up, not in something that you think of as like a typical liberal stronghold, like Washington State does a lot of really great stuff, right? They've passed paid family leave. They are working on paid sick days. But, we think of that as like a very liberal, well, and it is a very liberal state, but Nebraska is not a place we think of that way. And I really liked seeing this idea crop up there. It made me think that maybe these ideas have become a political winner. I mean, even if it's just for Democrats, right? Like, even if we don't see Republicans necessarily carrying this banner, for a Democrat in a red state to say, I'm gonna stake my name on this package of legislation, I think is a really important step and says a lot about the state of these policies and what the momentum looks like and what the political reality might look like in the future if we keep pushing on them.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that state level Republicans would get more behind these kinds of policies if there were more women in the state legislatures?
If there were more women Republicans, or just more women generally?
More women and more women Republicans at the state level. It seems to me that the state representative numbers for women are dismally low. It's something like 18 to 20% of women in state legislators are women. And I would imagine that those numbers probably skew a little bit more toward Democrats, just because women, as a group, tend to be more liberal.
Yeah.
But I think that there are a lot of these issues. It gets a little fuzzy when you start talking about fiscal policy, because I think a lot of Republicans have slightly different ideas about how to pay for some of these things. But I do think there are several Republican women, not several, but there are many Republican women who might be open to, these kinds of policies if they, had, if they, like the social insurance idea that, if you have a tax to help pay for it, then it's sort of beneficial to everyone, and, everybody pays into the program, so everybody gets a benefit out of it. It just makes me wonder if these issues might be more bipartisan if there were more women and Republicans in the state legislature.
Yeah, well, I definitely think we'd see more of these probably if there were just more women, period. I mean, as you point out, that women are not well represented in state legislatures, and when we see these packages of legislation crop up, there's always a woman involved. Mm-hmm. Maybe she's not taking the lead, but there's always female legislators involved, and on the federal level, it's Nancy Pelosi, Kirsten Gillibrand, Rosa DeLauro. I mean, men certainly support these things, but almost always we've seen women spearheading them and pushing them along. So if we're seeing women in Nebraska taking it up, if we had more women in, Oklahoma's state legislature, just to pick a state, maybe we would see it there too. Not to pick on Oklahoma, they may have a lot of women in their legislature, but
they do have a female governor.
And there you go. So, but yeah, I think in terms of the bipartisan appeal, paid family leave, I think, is probably the easiest sell, because you can design it in a way, like you said, where it's a social insurance program where employees are paying into it. So it's not like businesses have to shell out the money. It's not like the government even has to shell out the money. It's the workers themselves who pay into it, just like Social Security, and then they see that benefit when they need it. And it's not just women who need that benefit, as you and I both know. It's also men who are fathers who need that benefit too. So, and unless you don't have a child, then you don't need it, but it's insurance in that way, in case you're going to need it further down the road. And that's basically how the states that have these programs have set them up. And it's the way that they've been designed when they've been introduced at the federal level. And honestly, I think that that's a place where you could, in theory, see Republicans get interested. I mean, I'm not saying that we probably will, but at the state level where the politics might be a little bit different and women particularly might be more interested in this, that could be a place. I think it's harder when it comes to paid sick days, where you really are telling employers how to, they have to change their policies. I think that's harder for conservatives to get on board with. Same with the minimum wage. You really are mandating the way that they treat their workers. And I think there is a really strong body of evidence for both, that these employers will see huge benefits from doing so, and it will come back to them in, increased productivity, lower turnover, better demand for their own goods and services. But I still think just that first step of telling employers the rules of the road is a hard one for a lot of conservatives.
Totally. All right. Thanks for taking a break from me.
No problem. So we will move on now to something else that's sort of happening in the States, but it's also a national trend. There was new data out today from the Guttmacher Institute about the abortion rate declining really substantially, and it not, however, having a whole lot to do necessarily with state-level abortion restrictions, which we know have been passed in just huge waves, basically since 2011. But the researchers basically said that this drop that they found in the abortion rate is not really related in many ways to those restrictions, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, so basically the abortion rate is now down to its lowest level since abortion became legal since 1973. So a lot of folks, I mean, it's one of those things where it has a very big indicator of sort of your lens on the world. So a lot of pro-lifers are like, hey, yeah, abortion is declining because we've stigmatized it and we've passed all this anti-choice legislation and we've made it a lot harder for you to get an abortion. While the pro-choicers are pointing out, well, over that same period of time, their contraception use and methods have become a lot more widely used and reliable. There are a lot more science-based rather than abstinence-only education in schools and available online. So there's just a lot of more information and there's a lot more access for folks who, might otherwise find themselves in a situation where they might be seeking an abortion because, there's, now emergency contraception, which prevents pregnancy to begin with, if you have a broken condom situation or unfortunately have been a victim of sexual assault. So there are just a lot more options for women out there these days. And, that use has just basically, that access and that use has skyrocketed at the same time that the abortion rate has slowly been declining. So I think that, when you look at the data and you look at what, the things that correlate best, I think it really can be said to be more of contraception use rather than, abortion restrictions, which actually spiked in 2010, and by that point, the abortion rate had already been on the decline for about a decade and a half. So,
right, yeah, the researchers were sort of saying by the time these things were actually in effect, the decline had basically already occurred, or at least a lot of it had already occurred. It's not to discount these laws, right? Like, these laws do restrict access, and that is bad. And it's also, I think there's many different ways to look at this kind of data, and a decline in the abortion rate is not necessarily a good thing if it means that women are not getting the abortions that they want or need, right?
Right.
But I do think it sounds like the data is a little bit more on the side of women are just better able to plan their pregnancies and have wanted pregnancies, which is huge. I mean, that's just such an important win for the country that you would think that both sides would be into, but of course contraception has become contentious, amazingly. And one thing I personally was very excited about in the data was they called out long-term contraception, or basically IUDs, and there are other forms of long-term contraception, but I think one thing that's happened that I've noticed just personally since about 2010 is that IUDs have come back into favor, and the stigma against them has started to really dissipate. For a really long time, they got a deservedly really bad rap in the 70s when they were doing really terrible things to women's uteruses. But since then, they've become so much more safe. And in Europe, where there was less of sort of an outrage about the dangers of them, the use kind of just continued, and they're very much in vogue there still. And the U.S. had a lot more catching up to do, and it was interesting. It was from the healthcare provider side, where they were nervous that they were going to be sued. If a woman was infertile and then later she took out her IUD and she tried to get pregnant, she would blame it on her OBGYN. So they were really scared. I had friends who told me, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I tried to get one and they said, well, they're not for women who haven't had babies yet. This is really for women who haven't gotten pregnant yet. Which is just not true.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that line of thinking has definitely changed. And I am an IUD evangelist. I use one. I love it. And I think it's a really great form of contraception.
Right.
And so I talk to people about it a lot. And I've noticed more and more people saying, deciding to go and get one.
Yeah.
And they're foolproof, basically. I mean, there is a very, very small risk that you could get pregnant, but you don't have to take a pill every day.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to put a condom on. It's just there, and it protects you. And I think that probably has a whole lot to do with the abortion rate going down.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. And, I think one of the things that a lot of Republicans and conservative lawmakers have railed against is this idea of making contraception access more universal. And that's actually a really key component of the Affordable Care Act is
Mm-hmm.
that whatever your method of contraception, whether it's the pill, whether it's slightly like a midterm contraception like the NuvaRing or the Depo-Provera shot, or a longer-term solution like the IUD, that should be covered without a copay. And the idea is that, it's preventative care because it's, something that is part of women's healthcare. It's part of, being able to have control over your reproductive destiny is an important part of your own personal healthcare. So I think that's, definitely become a sticking point in the new law. And that's, it's crazy that, on one hand you have, conservatives saying, we really want to stop abortion. We want to make sure that abortions never happen. If you genuinely believe, as some do, that, it's the killing of a human being, it's just confusing to me, because you'd think if that were really your perspective, then you would want to be promoting contraception as much as you possibly could.
Right.
Just because that's the best way, is for women to really be able to control their reproductive health care from the beginning.
Right. But I think what the debate over contraception has exposed in many ways is that this is not about the killing of an unborn baby. This is about sex. And this is about controlling women who have sex. I'm for some reason blanking on who said Uncle Sugar
Mike
is paying for your
Huckabee.
libido. Thank you. It's like old white guy. I can't remember his name.
Yeah, former Mississippi, Arkansas governor and former presidential candidate.
Yep. And what he was basically saying was contraception is it's like this gateway libido drug. He makes it sound like women's Viagra.
Mm-hmm.
Like you pop a birth control pill and then you've got this crazy libido, which is a very weird way of looking at it, but it exposes the fact that he's worried about women having sex. He's not worried about Viagra,
Mm-hmm.
right? He's not bringing up Viagra or condoms.
Right.
He's worried about the female body. I think that there are certainly people who oppose abortion because they believe it is the killing of an unborn child. And there may be people also who have been convinced that contraception is the same thing, even though it's not. And, I don't want to say that those people don't exist, but I do think there's a lot of people who sort of are leading the anti-contraception movement, if you want to call it that, not on those grounds,
Mm-hmm.
but on the grounds of being afraid of what it means that women can control their own bodies and their own sexualities.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Sarah Posner had a great piece for Religion Dispatches where she sort of went through all of the amicus briefs for the Hobby Lobby case, which is the case before the Supreme Court on whether for-profit companies can opt out of birth control coverage for their employees, whether or not they are a for-profit or a non-profit. And I think it's a fascinating case in part because I think the Supreme Court has already shown tendencies toward letting corporations have sort of a personhood beyond what most of us might think of as, the entity of a corporation. And, it's fascinating in the legal sense, but, Sarah went through all those documents, and what she basically found was a lot of folks were putting forth a lot of sort of junk science arguments that, basically weren't really grounded in what the peer-reviewed scientific community had found about contraception. And, these are the things that supposedly the Supreme Court will consider when taking up this case. So, I find it really, really fascinating to see sort of like what your arguments when it comes to contraception reveal about you, and in that sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I do think it's been really revealing. And I know a lot of sort of pro-choice activists feel very vindicated right now because they've been making this argument for a really long time that Republicans are coming after your contraception, and now they actually are. And I think, so they feel vindicated. They're like, see? That's what this was about. But also, I think it's a very dangerous place for conservatives to go. I mean, maybe their base will come along, but a lot of women in their base are using birth control. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them are either dating or married to men who benefit from that. And I think contraception is actually, abortion certainly is still a very, difficult topic in this country. Contraception is not. Contraception is pretty much settled for a lot of people. And I just think it's a dangerous step to go after people's birth control.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to the thing you just mentioned, and that is that I think contraception in particular, and abortion also, which I think you could make the same argument, are often characterized as women's issues, quote unquote women's issues. These are things women care about, which tends to be disproportionately true, but also basically everyone who has sex uses contraception.
Right.
So it's a little confusing to me that this is painted as a quote unquote women's issue, or that women can't control their libidos. Basically, you are using contraception together with your partner when you're a heterosexual couple. You are, you're both using it, if that makes sense. And it's really confusing to me how, how this argument gets propped up as something that you can, paint this as a women's issue, because everybody is using it. Everybody is participating in the same system of contraception. So good luck with that.
Right. And like I said, who's going after condoms? It's just women's contraception that falls under attack, and it makes me really wish scientists would speed up their inquiry into male birth control, or at least find a market for it. I mean, I feel like scientists are also like, men aren't going to use it, so whatever. But having a male birth control pill or something like that would just change this so fundamentally and dramatically, if it ever were to happen.
Yep. I completely agree.
So, shall we tackle our last and not the most pleasant topic for the evening?
Yeah.
Which is the op-ed or letter, I guess I should call it, from Dylan Farrow in the New York Times over the weekend, basically telling her side of the story for the first time, from what I take it, about the allegations of sexual assault against her father at the time, Woody Allen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to jump in.
And it's important to note that a lot of this stuff has been out there for a long time already. I think Vanity Fair first reported some of this stuff 20 years ago. And although this is the first time Dylan, who, goes by a different name now, so we call this person Dylan, even though, she doesn't identify that way in her sort of everyday life. But, it's something that has been sort of lurking beneath the surface, that it's something that folks knew or suspected about Woody Allen for a long time. And the fact that Dylan came forward with her story at this point is, I would say, really brave of her, in part because one of the first things that we've seen is sort of the backlash against the story. I think the Daily Beast wrote something actually before Dylan came forward with her story in Christoph's column this weekend, but, kind of, refuting claims line by line. And it was hard to read just because I think it's an issue that and I feel like this has happened over and over again when sort of molestation, sexual assault accusations about harassment, those kinds of things come forward. There's always a tendency for there to be a public backlash against the person making the allegations, and it's too bad because it makes me feel like anyone who has been a victim of abuse, assault, things like that, it makes them harder to come forward ultimately when they see how folks are treated publicly when they come forward with allegations.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of survivors talk about it feeling like a second violation.
Mm-hmm.
And so few of them see justice. I mean, if we're to believe Dylan's account, Woody Allen abused her and then got away with it. He was never convicted and
received a Lifetime Achievement Award nonetheless.
Right. I think the hardest part for me reading her, I mean, the whole thing was hard to read, right? Mm-hmm. But one of the things that really struck me was when she says she's basically haunted by her abuser because he's everywhere. He's a very famous man. His movies, he makes a lot of movies. They've done very well, and she sees his face everywhere, and that just must be torment. Mm-hmm. And it's very hard to watch. And yeah, like you said, now she's basically on trial, mm-hmm. and not just from the Daily Beast. Melissa McEwen at Shake's Tweets had a post today where she called out Nick Kristof, and I hadn't even really caught this, but he did that introductory paragraph to her op-ed because it was in his column, mm-hmm. and he said he has a line about how Woody Allen deserves the presumption of innocence, and what she said was basically, no, Dylan deserves the presumption of innocence. We don't know what happened. You can't say that you know what happened about Woody Allen, but to say that he deserves the presumption of innocence right before you're letting her tell her story, you're basically saying he deserves for you to not believe what she says, mm-hmm. right? And I would assume Kristof did not mean that. He is an advocate for women in many ways, so I would give him the benefit of the doubt for sure there. But I think what it shows really is just the way that we talk about sexual assault survivors and the people they accuse, and sort of the lopsided presumption of innocence, right? It's so often the case that the victims are the one who are not presumed innocent, that they are presumed to be lying or manipulating things or, trying to defame someone to get money or fame, which I've always found pretty preposterous, because if you look at, what happens to these women who come forward, they are dragged through the mud. It basically ruins their lives, or at least changes them dramatically. It's very rare that they get justice, and if they get justice, that they get some sort of financial reward or whatever you might think would come with that. They basically are just standing up for themselves and for justice and getting very little out of it, and getting kind of, basically re-abused in the process. And it's very strange to me that people look at that and say, oh, well, women are so prone to fabricate these mm-hmm. things. I'm sure there are there have been fabricated sexual assault cases, right, where it was proven not to be true, but they are relatively rare, and I think the people who speak up about it deserve at least our doubt against the person they accuse, if not our belief in them. And that is true even if they are a very powerful, talented man.
Mm-hmm. And I think the more powerful, the more respected the accused, actually the less likely that person is to ever come to justice. I think when we talked about bringing this topic up, the there were many people that came to mind as, sort of previous examples of sort of the, defense of the accused and the backlash against the alleged victim. But, of those, I think the sort of principal example is Roman Polanski, and he's actually one of the few who's actually been convicted. So
yeah,
it's and I think it's really hard for a lot of people to sort of to deal with that cognitive dissonance, to square those two circles. I wouldn't say I'm a huge Woody Allen fan, but a lot of people really like his movies. A lot of people think he's a talented artist, and I think it's important to recognize and be able to reconcile that you may like the product that somebody has made, but you have to keep in mind that that person may not be the best human being, or that person may have done really terrible things to another person.
Right. Yeah, people are really complicated, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people can do good work and be bad people. It happens a lot.
Mm-hmm.
When we were talking before we started recording, I had brought up Julian Assange, because for me, that just really brings up the huge difficulty his supporters had when the allegations of sexual assault against him surfaced. That there was this knee-jerk need to protect him from those allegations, just to say there's no way he could have done that, and those women are sluts and they're lying. And I respect his work. I think that, he has done some real good in the world with the work that he's done, but that also does not negate the fact that I think that he should stand trial for the sexual assaults that he's accused of.
Or
and
at
those
least
two things,
answer police questions, which he hasn't even
right.
done.
Right, yeah. I think the women who have accused him deserve their day in court. And those two things are not in contradiction of each other. Those two things exist equally in my mind and can cohabitate in my mind. And I think it's really hard for people to feel that way. And the other thing I think that we have to remember, too, is that sexual predators are often extremely charismatic. They are talented, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them are they're charismatic because they're good at not only sort of buying their way in with the people they abuse, finding the people who are going to be the easiest to victimize often, but also in being able to cover their tracks and get buy-in from the community and support from the community. That is a thing the sexual predators do. And so we shouldn't be too surprised that the people who we think are charismatic and talented can also be people who are sexual predators. Like, that is, I'm not saying that all the charismatic people are predators, but that is not a thing that should surprise us, that someone you think is charismatic is a predator. That's not something that's sort of illogical, right?
Right. Well, it's a lot more comforting to think of sexual predators as social outcasts and freaks and people who you would never want to talk to or see, because then that means you don't know any sexual predators, or you could never be a victim of sexual assault or sexual abuse. But, the reality is that, they exist among us, and they, and I think it's important to note that the reason this is so frustrating, I think, for a lot of victims is that most assailants, to use that word, are, there's been a little research that they don't often just commit this kind of crime once. There's some great research a few years ago where they sort of took anonymous surveys, and they asked, have you ever, attempted or completed a sexual act with someone who is unwilling or passed out or anything like that? And a significant number of the respondents not only said yes, but said they had done so multiple times.
Right. Right. People who commit sexual assault tend to be someone you know,
mm-hmm.
and possibly someone you trust.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think it's also really important that they don't just do it to one person. They do it over and over again. And I think that's, to go back to your point about, watching what happens to people who speak up. and how much they are put on trial, how dangerous that is. Because if people don't speak up, these rapists have free reign to keep doing what they do. If we know that rapists tend to target other victims, then if we can't get the victims to speak up, then they're just going to keep committing these acts. It's really, really dangerous. It's not just, you know, really hard to watch for the victims themselves, but it's also endangering everybody else.
Yeah, and I think just to bring it back to Woody Allen, there's been sort of a revisiting of his work and the way a lot of people view his sort of perspective as an artist in light of these allegations. And I think, you know, that's an important thing to do too. If you're a fan of his work, and you are now, you know, that you're confronted with the idea that these allegations could be true, you know, I think for a lot of people, that's putting his work in a new and different light. Yeah. Well, what a depressing note to end our blogging gingers on.
We started with the Super Bowl and we ended in a very difficult place, but thank you again for chatting with me. I think it was good all the way through if some of these conversations are tough. Yeah, definitely. And you know, I would just say that I hope that, you know, victims of abuse and assault don't necessarily feel intimidated out of coming forward with their stories just because of the media backlash. And I would hope that they would be honest and forthright about those things. Yeah, and that they're able to find the support they need from community or elsewhere to go through it. Yeah, and I would just add that every victim may not be able to or willing to come forward for whatever reason. And, you know, I think, like you said, the support piece of that is really important, that for a lot of people, they may not be able to come forward when they want to, or, you know, may not be able to grapple with what happened to them right away. And I think that's okay too. They need to deal with it in a way that makes sense for them. Yeah, I mean, her op-ed came so many years after this was all in the public spotlight, but I don't think that makes it any less important or brave that she is speaking out. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, good chatting with you, and stay warm out there. You too. All right. All right. Thanks so much, Bryce, and thank you. I hope you have a good night. You too. All right. Bye. Bye-bye.